I can say happy Friday, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the Open Documentation Hour. Today, we've got Artem, who's going to talk to us about GitHub Actions. But before I hand you over to Artem, I just want to say again that in a couple of weeks, we're going to go into like a planning phase for the next 6 months of these sessions and also the Canonical Open Documentation Academy itself. So please leave your comments on the forum or here or on Matrix if you'd like us to consider something or change something that we do. Is one of these every week too many, for example? Or would you like to see more, or would you like them to be shorter, or would you like us to do it in a different format? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, we're going to be at the Ubuntu Summit, which is at the end of the month in The Hague. If anybody's around in the Netherlands or Amsterdam or The Hague, then we'll be close by if you want to pop in and say hello. We're going to have a booth over that weekend, but it's free to attend, but there's other things going on as well. And I know that things have been perhaps a little bit, quiet a little bit on the Academy. We've been busy helping people with their tasks and things, but we really want to kind of ramp up activity again when we get back from the planning phase and really capitalize on what's been a really wonderful first 5 or 6 months. And so thank you all for your support. With that, I'm going to make sure that Artem has the right meeting credentials to be able to do his thing. Add as a co-host, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Artem. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Graham. Hi, everyone. Sorry for being slightly late. I totally lost track of time. I thought it was an hour earlier. So today we're going to talk about GitHub Actions as applied to documentation efforts. My name is Artem. I'm a senior technical author here at Canonical, and let's start with figuring out what it is and what it isn't. So this is not a conversation about GitHub Actions per se, because their capabilities are vast and numerous, so I will not even try to cover any significant part of that in any detail, but you can always refer to that their own documentation, which is pretty good as far as documentation goes. This is instead mostly about document operations, which is obviously a term now for using the same bag of tricks that DevOps, which is also a fancy term, that DevOps use for code, for software deployments and stuff like this, but instead applying all of that to documentation work, which warrants, well, implicitly using the Docs code approach. And this is the first premise I will be using. So I would assume that you do Docs code on GitHub specifically, because if you're using any other code hosting platform such as GitLab or anything else, or maybe Launchpad, well, it will be different for you, and you are trying to go from lots of manual labor to lots of automated labor. So let's briefly talk about what GitHub Actions are. It's a platform for it's GitHub's own platform for CI/CD operations, which means that it knows a lot about what Git is and what can occur in Git and what GitHub is. I hope you know that these two things are vastly different, and it uses all kinds of customizations to automate your code repositories with actions. The best thing, it's free for public non-commercial projects, or I believe something in that vein. I won't go into much detail here, but you can use it to a certain extent without paying a significant amount of money. Almost everything is declarative there, at least at the beginning. So you write workflows with simple YAML, as they like to put it. Obviously, no YAML is simple. It's kind of tricky actually, but mostly it's done with YAML shell scripts, and you get a library of templates and ready-made actions on top of that. So you won't maybe have to reinvent the wheel or Python installation or create images for Ubuntu or stuff like that. Everything is ready for you. So everything starts with events, which is anything that occurs in Git on GitHub. It can be a fork, a release, a pull request, a push, a commit. I think a commit. No, I don't think a commit has an event per se, but never mind. Events trigger workflows, which is a term, which is the basic unit of work, which is defined in YAML, and it lists a number of jobs and is reusable, which is a very important part of our further conversation. Jobs are run on runners, which are, you can have GitHub hosted runners. You can use your own self-hosted runners, which are essentially VMs, containers, whatever. You can customize some degree of parallelism for that, but that's not the point here. A job itself is just a number of steps which can be put under some sort of a condition, and each step just provides a flow of settings and inputs from one script or action to another. That's all they do. And you obviously can write your own scripts. You can define your custom actions or reuse a really huge number of pre-existing ones from the GitHub marketplace. And that's essentially everything there is to know. So thank you. Goodbye. Obviously not. So as applied to docs, what value do or can you get from GitHub Actions? First of all, in my personal experience, this is what can cover roughly 90% of your needs. You can get live previews of anything you do with your repo, like be it branches, be it commits, be it even pull requests. You can customize your workflows into showing them live or showing them live not only for you to make sure everything builds correctly, but to your team members, to people who you don't want to educate in, I don't know, running a local version of the documentation server, or maybe set up staging a server on a self-hosted VPS or whatever. The rest of this is pretty much straightforward. It's validation, all kinds of that, from very simple like spelling to quite complex procedures like code sample testing and so on and so forth. A different thing is conversions, because this is something that you do on your code base to get essentially more code or more assets. You can even create workflows that add commits on top of your commits, but that's a very, very dangerous thing to do, because you can run into an endless cycle. But you can auto-generate all sorts of reference documentation from your code. You can build schemas, you can build PDF files, you can run XSL transformations, really anything. And you obviously can take your repo elsewhere and render the results of your changes on your website, in your CMS, or anywhere else. This also gives you the benefit of reusing the workflows over and over, because you can use a single workflow with multiple repos quite easily. You can keep your wonderful scripts and wonderful checks and wonderful customizations in a single repo and reuse it over and over again without the need to remember which version of that make file goes into that repo, and so on and so forth. So this is pretty much it. I won't venture to suggest that it should be built for anything else, because that's more than enough already. But if you have anything else at this moment, please share. The next thing, a practical demonstration, because I don't want to do only talking today. So let me share. The first part of this is a workflow for a little thing we call the starter pack, which is essentially a bunch of configurations for Sphinx that we use here at Canonical. Let me share my page now. This is what it is. So this is the repo. And here in this folder under GitHub Workflows, we have the workflows, specifically 3 simple YAML files, of which we are interested in this one, the automatic doc checks. Let's take a look. That's all there is, really. So going line by line, it has a name. It runs on certain event types, which are pushes to the main branch, which are PRs. And this is a very good example of bad naming. This is essentially a manual run. It has some concurrency settings that say that only one instance of this workflow per per essentially a branch or a repo per per a Git reference, to use the term, can only run once, and it can be canceled. So, and the jobs are entirely borrowed from our documentation workflows repo, and the only argument it gets is the working directory where it should run, so it runs here, not much. If we go to the Actions tab, we can see the results of the previous runs. Here we have listed all the workflows defined in those YAML files. We have the results of our previous runs. Some are good, some are not good. And if you click something, you can see the finer details, but I won't go there because this is the extent of what you can see publicly. So let's talk instead about the other more interesting repo, which is the documentation workflows. Let me see. Oh, that's good. Here we have a nice README, some code under different folders, and the same GitHub workflows definitions, which in our case is a single file called documentation checks, which is borrowed from the main branch of this repo, of this file, is borrowed by a previous workflow. So what do we have here? It has a name. It has a number of events. Technically, it's also only a single event, but a really large one. It's an invocation of a workflow, and it has a number of inputs, which can be customized, but it gets the working directory, which we mentioned previously, and it's mandatory, and it has no default settings. Other than that, we have the version of Python required for the build. We have the makefile name required for the build. We have some target names for the makefile, but all of these have reasonable defaults, and it has a number of outputs that are used in the jobs that it runs. So it has a spell check result, it has a link check result. Essentially, these are the results of the checks that the workflow runs, and we have the jobs defined. And here we have something substantial. So we have the dark checks group, which defines a number of results that we've seen previously. It runs on Ubuntu, which makes sense for Canonical, and it has a number of steps. So the first step relies on a predefined, a very, very simple Git checkout step, which checks out the repo. Then another very, very simple step to set up a Python environment. And we have the Python version defined here, remember? So this gives us, oh yeah, here we pass the parameter. After that, we run the checks. We have their names, their IDs, and some custom conditions that this means, for example, that the check needs to run regardless of whether other parts or steps in the job were successful or not. It uses some parts of the code. Here it borrows from this folder that we've seen previously, and it requires some settings to be passed on, but we have these as defaults. The same occurs for every other check here. The only difference is maybe this one, because it continues an error, which means it is not essential to make the entire workflow succeed in a way. Because it can fail, but the workflow in general will be considered a success. If we get back to what the specific steps run, like for example, the spell check, here we have an action definition, which is a custom action, and it has a name, it has a description, it has some inputs that we've set previously, and it runs something fancy. So it runs a command which includes Python, some custom settings, and it runs a Python script passing on every parameter we have. So how does it look? Well, it's a Python script that runs, well, it essentially does a few customizations, and after that it launches the make file. So that's how it's done, folks. Nothing to see here. Oh, okay. Let's move on. Let's get back to our slides. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, that the documentation workflows repo is kind of public, so you can well, reuse it in your own projects if you need to, but that will require you to follow our way of arranging things, obviously. Some thoughts on workflow design. First of all, the good thing is that there's plenty of advice available regarding GitHub Actions, CI/CD in general. This is essentially a DevOps task. But first of all, GitHub Actions suit best anything that you need to spread across your entire team and make as consistent as possible. If you have an approach that you would like your entire team to adopt, if you have a policy to enforce, this is a good way to use. As we've seen in the practical demonstration, you need to group everything by purpose, by stage, and so on and so forth. And it takes a lot of design and thinking about how to do this best. So one piece of advice I would like to share and stop and maybe focus on is you need to build a funnel to make sure that the earlier a step occurs, the cheaper, the faster, and the more prone to failure it is. Because if you have steps that are basically guaranteed to fail at the end of your workflow, well, it will not be a good thing to have. People will not be happy. You will not be happy. Instead, you want to fail as fast as possible. We'll fast break things. The other consideration I would like to voice here is that not everything needs to be codified in GitHub Actions because, for example, there are other ways to implement spell checks. There are other ways to implement linting. Like ideally, if you can enforce a policy that makes everyone run these checks on their local machines, by all means do so, because that would save you a lot of CPU cycles during builds. The next thing on my list is essentially it's a piece of Unix philosophy. You need to stick to singular purpose for everything you do. Like you don't want to build a huge workflow that does all of it at once, because you will need to figure out how these steps are codependent or interdependent. The same applies to actions, to how your workflows interact if you are reusing them, and so on and so forth. And like I said, a lot of thinking needs to go into figuring out what can run in parallel, what can fail, what should not fail, what are the preconditions, like maybe should we allow this check if that check failed previously, and so on and so forth. Finally, you need to be very consistent in your refactoring and reuse approach, because just copy pasting your old scripts into GitHub Actions and running them, well, this is something you can start with, but obviously this can be done in a better way. But speaking of maintenance and learning curves and stuff like this, let's talk about why you should consider at least using this. First of all, I know for sure that many documentarians like to keep all sorts of, I don't know, checklists of spreadsheets to control and track everything by hand. This is better done with some sort of automation, and GitHub Actions is a viable candidate for that. So you can codify your documentation expertise to eventually improve the quality of your work, of your output. You can make all the checks, all the considerations, all the style choices explicit, actionable, and sort of unavoidable, because with some effort, people can maybe work around your fancy schmancy GitHub Actions, but they will need to spend some effort doing that. You probably will benefit from using GitHub Actions to enforce some policies, some approaches, some processes across your entire team, and to eventually automate everything not directly related to the quality of your writing, because this is the core value of the work you do. You do writing. You don't get paid for being a mediocre bash scripter. When to use this? First of all, when you find yourself in a situation when even convoluted make files, even convoluted scripts, and all sorts of pre-commit hooks, which is another viable solution I can entirely recommend taking a look at. When you find that all of that is not enough in your situation, when you work with people who maybe not share some parts of your approach, who don't share some parts of your approach to how documentation should be done, how commits should be done, how PRs should be done, and so on and so forth. And when you find essentially copying your snippets, your makefiles, your whatever, over and over, and finding all sorts of discrepancies between older copies and newer copies, and when it's a tangled mess. Finally, the drawbacks, the very important slide, possibly the second most important slide of this presentation, is when you shouldn't do this, or at least what you should account for when you're doing GitHub Actions. First of all, very often, my experience comes a situation when people use GitHub Actions simply because they know how to use them and they have used them in their previous project. So, okay, let's jump on this bandwagon. If you have a hammer in your hands, not everything should look like a nail, really. Second thing, this is something about the design effort and the learning effort for new joiners to a team, especially if you come up with a very, very complex workflow that requires all sorts of reuse, multiple repos here, there. People who will encounter this without maybe knowing anything about GitHub or GitHub Actions, well, that's a steep learning curve. You will need to account for the maintenance and troubleshooting effort, because debugging a complex workflow on GitHub, staring at these walls of console output and figuring out that, okay, this failed because that setting in this repo was maybe not updated properly, because that PR wasn't, oh, well, that's kind of convoluted. You will encounter probably longer builds, and if you store your documentation along with your code, this may interfere with your code builds, especially if you require your developers to maybe make sure their code is covered with documentation. This happens. You need to understand the implications of the documentation-related actions to the entire picture. Yes, Graham?
Sorry, Artem, I clicked on the wrong thing. Carry on.
Oh, no problem. It's obviously easier to break a complex workflow, because if you don't use GitHub Actions at all, or if you're using the very basic things, there's not much to break. And finally, a bit more subtle consideration: if you implement something in GitHub Actions, you will have at least a few issues along the way if you try to migrate to, I don't know, GitLab or some self-hosted service like Gitier, or to absolutely different, or to an absolutely different VCS like Mercurial or whatever. And finally, the most important consideration of all, like, you need to compare the amount of time and effort saved to the benefits you gain from using GitHub Actions, which, as most things in the software industry do, has a really good SKCD comic to accomplish this. So thank you for your time. I hope it was worth it. I'm sorry I didn't have the time to add any names here, but thanks to my colleagues, thanks to Graham, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Artem. Iqbal actually raised a hand during the presentation. I don't know if Iqbal, you still want to ask your question. Yeah, thank you. I know that this is a complicated subject. If anybody would like to ask Artem a question, go for it. Go for it, Nick.
Great work, great overview there, Artem. I was just wondering if you had any advice for people. Obviously, as you've stated, there's a certain amount of commitment and work involved in setting up these actions. So, what would you say were the top 2 or 3 things that every docs repo should try and automate or check in this way?
That's a very good question. I mean, it really depends on the technology stack you're using for your docs, because my suggestion for, I don't know, Jekyll would be slightly different from what I would suggest for Sphinx. But first of all, I would probably start with technology agnostic checks, like spelling, obviously, some style checks, some linting with Veil maybe, which is many people actually do have in place. The links. Well, I'm not coming up with anything fancy here, obviously.
Yeah, no, I sort of agree. I think that the basic things are useful to get right, and the great thing about those ones that you mentioned is that there are already so many great examples of people using those workflows. So I guess, you know, a tip for anyone who's considering this is to look at some documentation you admire and see how they're doing things, and maybe borrow some stuff from there.
One thing I would like to mention, though, on top of that, is that if you can create any sort of testing framework for your code samples, for your command line samples that you present in your documentation, by all means do so, because obsolete documentation, stale documentation is the scourge of our industry.
Do you know of any kind of frameworks that can help with that, that can help run tests, for example, on command line arguments and the expected output?
Well, again, that depends on the stack you use, because I believe Python has something built in for that purpose, which enables you to run Python code like with docstrings or whatever. Some people came up with this thing called Doc Detective, which is mostly, I think it's more UI oriented, but nonetheless, it's heavy on JavaScript and stuff like this. Otherwise, well, the problem is we don't have a really popular solution that I would call a go-to choice for anybody. Everything has to be heavily customized depending on your product, first of all.
Thanks, Artem. If anybody else has any questions, please go ahead or raise your hand or type in a question. Iqbal has said, actually, for fellow newbies, GitHub Actions is why my account was suspended for 50 years, so be careful when you're using them. I think, yeah, GitHub's become more concerned perhaps with some of the endless testing and CPU cycles being burnt through GitHub Actions. I hope this isn't a stupid question, Artem, but I did want to ask if I didn't see the logic of the tests in what you were showing. Is that something that I've missed, or where does that actually exist? What is, for example, the spell checking command that gets run?
I believe I stopped briefly on that. Usually, these steps run in a simple sequence, and if a step fails, the entire workflow fails, which is kind of reasonable, a safe default to rely on. But you can define all sorts of conditions and preconditions. You can run steps regardless of whether the previous steps failed or not. So you can create steps that run anyway, despite everything that happens beside them. You can run steps, actions, and I would venture entire workflows conditionally. Like if the outcome of this step or this job of this or this workflow is this, then you need to run this, and so on and so forth. So you start building a Turing complete machine out of these actions, which is not necessarily a good thing, because coding in YAML is not a good thing to do, in my personal opinion. That's why I'm kind of reluctant to, weigh in heavily on the algorithmic aspect of GitHub Actions.
So I think we did you mean what actually got run in those?
I was wondering. Yeah, I saw some reference to a make file or.
Yeah, I had some input on this. So it's a bit unusual, that action, because we decided to make sure that everything that we run automatically could also be run locally, that we would expose targets in the makefile in the documentation repository to run those steps. So the action basically pulls the whole repo and then runs the commands that you would run locally to do exactly the same thing, which the logic of it is fairly sound, because it means if you're working locally and you run make spelling and it passes, then you should be, take some assurance that when you make the PR, it's also going to pass the spelling test. So that was the logic behind it. But it isn't common, because most people use, as we've sort of mentioned, a lot of people borrow workflows from other projects, or from the marketplace that publish there. So in which case the code that's being executed, the steps that are being run are predefined, if you like, and aren't local.
I see.
This is actually. Oh, thank you, Nick. I believe this is a very good example of how it happens in the wild, because the moment you get a new requirement, this requirement, that requirement, like it should run locally as well as remotely, and so on and so forth. This moment you find yourself in the need of writing a bunch of scripts, make files, Python code, YAML code, and so on and so forth, just to make a pretty reasonable thing work. And this is something that I should probably warn you about, at least. Not against, but about.
Thanks, Artem. Thanks, Nick. Anybody else have any questions? It's such a, I know it is well documented on GitHub, as you mentioned earlier on, Artem. So that's a really good place to get started if you're interested in doing this. When I haven't played with that actions too much, but the way that I got started was, as you've done, is like clone a repository that's already doing it and try and modify somebody else's workflow.
Yeah, and it should be mentioned, if you already have some scripts or whatever that do something, it's fairly trivial to convert those into a workflow. Some of the best examples actually run sort of blobs of Python or Bash scripts even. They're just executing them from that workflow.
And I guess you just have to make sure that they comply to like the standard error outputs and things like that. Yeah.
But you can. I mean, you can. There's a degree of customization you can make on the runner that GitHub will use. So you can specify versions of Ubuntu or versions of Python, or all sorts of things. So there is some flexibility. It's also a great way for sort of thinking about documentation. It's a great way of doing things like if you have, I've seen documentation that has things for people to download, like a PDF of X, Y, or Z, and a workflow is a great way to automatically generate those PDFs, for example. So it's not all about checking things. It can be a useful way of managing assets as well.
Yes, and again, this also emphasizes the need to maybe raise the bar for your scripting work when you start doing GitHub Actions. Because, for example, when you run all these blobs of Python code locally, it's enough to get a 0 or 1. Okay, did it work? Did it not? That's enough for me on my local machine. But when you are creating an action, you have to make sure that your logging is first of all, it exists. Second, it goes in the right stream because it will need to appear in the output stream on GitHub for anybody else to see and maybe debug what went wrong, what didn't, and so on and so forth. Not mentioning the simple fact that other people will be reading your code.
Awesome. Any more questions? If not, I think I'm going to stop the recording. And then if anybody wants to like ask any questions about Artem's presentation or GitHub Actions or the Academy out of the recording, then you're more than welcome. With that, I think I will stop it. Oh, I just want to thank you, Artem. Thanks for putting all that together and for doing the presentation.
No problem at all.